morning is, our speaker this morning is Ben Miller, who is the president of the Mud Creek Conservancy and Sargent Park project. This is an all volunteer land trust. And he has been the president since 2019. It's a 25-acre habitat which had been under threat of development for decades, but will soon become a nature park. Ben is a Purdue graduate, so right at home here, from the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. He spent 10 years with the DNR in the Division of Fish and Wildlife. So he's interested in water in all its many aspects. And he's also leading the Healthy Rivers Initiative, which is one of the state's largest land protection projects. He's very interested in habitat connectivity, watershed restoration and protection, building partnerships within the community, and connecting people to nature. He's just returned from a month in Costa Rica, so he's an internationalist as well as an Indiana native. So please welcome Ben Miller.
Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you all for having me out to speak with you today. I'm sure you all are feeling relieved to be able to meet in person again, and I think this is my first larger meeting to present to, and so that's really exciting to see faces and present in person. So yeah, as Cynthia mentioned, my name is Ben Miller. I'm the president of Mud Creek Conservancy. Before I'll get into some more details about who we are and where we're working and what we're working on, but before I get started, the title of my presentation is the Mud Creek Valley Conservancy and Sargent Road Nature Park. So spoiler alert, those are the things we're going to be talking about. But more for my sake, I was just kind of curious to do a quick poll. So I know there's those of you watching on Zoom as well. I may not be able to quite tally your votes, but you can use the raise hand function if you want to participate. But if you just raise your hand, I'm going to ask you kind of what you're aware of and just kind of give me an idea before I get presenting. So who of you have heard of Mud Creek when it comes to central Indiana, the Indianapolis Mud Creek? That's pretty good. That's probably at least 75% of you. There's a Mud Creek Road, so you may have driven on that. There's the Mud Creek Players Barn, a nice place to go see a local show. And there's a Mud Creek Farm now. And so the moniker is kind of sticking, but it's all referring back to actual Mud Creek that flows through Northeast Indianapolis, up into Fishers and ultimately Madison County, where its headwaters are. So we call that area the Mud Creek Valley, specifically that area in Northeast Indianapolis, where there's some unique topography and actually a valley there where Mud Creek runs through. So that's kind of our project area, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And so let's see if this. All right, I'll just point to you. All right, so Mud Creek Conservancy, as the name entails, is an organization focused on Mud Creek and Conservancy, really conserving Mud Creek as the area. So we are a nonprofit organization. We're a 501c3, and I always like to make the plug. That means that your donations to us are tax deductible. I get that out of the way right at the beginning. And we are also an all volunteer organization. We are a land trust, so really the purpose of our organization is to preserve land. We can hold land, whether it be owned land, conservation easements, and ultimately that is our function for the area to conserve land is preserving land and habitat. Are you all familiar with land trusts? So you've probably heard of some others in the area. Central Indiana Land Trust is another very active, larger land trust in the area. The Nature Conservancy, if you've heard of them, they're a global land trust, so the largest land trust in the world. They have offices all across the world, every state, almost every country. And so what I consider us a hyper local land trust, because not only are we within one state, we really are within a very specific project area, a watershed that covers 3 counties. And so why is there an organization specifically working on one watershed? There are other groups like that across Indiana. I think the more of those we have, the better off we are. You have people who live in the area, concerned about an area, trying to do work to make it better or preserve something about that. So we think Mud Creek is pretty special, not just the creek itself, but really we're talking about that watershed as a whole. And so one thing that actually led me to living in the Mud Creek area and ultimately getting involved with Mud Creek Conservancy was when my wife and I were looking for our first home. We knew we wanted to live in a wooded area. And so we were looking all across central Indiana, not just in Indianapolis. And so if you've ever been on Zillow or Google Maps, we were basically zooming out on a map, turning on the satellite layer and looking for homes for sale within those green patches of forest. And that's how we kind of started our home search. And it brought us to the Mud Creek Valley, where we found homes close to the city, but also in these forested areas. And you can see that, unfortunately, plain as day, if you go on Google Maps and go to the satellite view, because we have so much, that concrete jungle effect of being in an urban area, the forested areas stick out like a sore thumb. And actually, the Mud Creek Valley looks like a sore thumb. It kind of has a base of protected land to the south, which is Fort Harrison State Park. And then extending, that's where Mud Creek flows into Fall Creek. So that confluence is actually within the state park. You can see that just off a trail. So it's a beautiful area where Mud Creek does flow in. So that's a great place to visit. But really extending north up Mud Creek towards the headwaters, all the way through that northeast Indianapolis area along a road called Sargent Road. Is anyone familiar with that road as well? Yeah, so I always like to recommend, if you haven't, drive up and down the road. It's interesting, it's pretty. This time of the year, maybe not. They did just patch it like 2 days ago, so maybe this is your chance. Those should hold for a couple more days, so you should get out there and enjoy a drive. But anyways, that Sargent Road kind of follows the valley, the low-lying area of the Mud Creek Valley. And you'll notice, especially right now when you can see through the trees, you'll notice there's some unique topography and geology in the area of some bluffs on both sides of Mud Creek and both sides of Sargent Road. And so that kind of makes it special. One, we have a remarkable amount of connected forest habitat, even though we have a lot of different private parcels that break it up. Much of that remains intact. That combined with the anchor of habitat at Fort Harrison State Park really creates this larger expanse of forest that many of our wildlife need to be able to persist in an urban area. Whereas you think of species like, you don't see box turtles, walking across the street here around the state fairgrounds because they need that contiguous forested area. And we do have species like that still holding on in the Mud Creek Valley, Fort Harrison State Park. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the species that we're trying to preserve. But just kind of on a zoomed out approach, that's kind of why we think it's special, why it's worth trying to preserve what we have left of forested area. It's really hard to get those areas back once they become developed. I think if we fast forward 50 or 100 years, that's probably going to be a more common practice, is taking these abandoned strip malls and broken up concrete and trying to restore them back into forests once we start to realize how important that is for urban areas to have. But right now, it's still expensive to preserve what we have, while it's, the 100-year-old forests that take a long time to regain those benefits. And so just taking a step back in time to the recent past, when we look at what has the change been like in our area, and we're talking about a specific area here, but this is probably very similar to many of kind of the suburbs of Indianapolis or the kind of the greater Indianapolis area. 1956, I know it's small, but you can probably recognize what those kind of geometric shapes are. Those are all different farm ground. That's agriculture predominantly taking place in the Northeast Indianapolis area. So it's always interesting talking to neighbors who have lived in the area or grew up in the area. So they've been there, 70, 80 years, and talking about how this used to be the country. This is where people from the city would come out and get exposed to farms and horses and cows. So this was the country. It's no longer the country, but it is a little bit different than the city feel. So then as kind of agriculture starts shrinking and growth starts expanding out from the city, 1979, you kind of see a hybrid approach going. There's still some farms holding on. but you're starting to see those parcel sizes shrink as people sell off their farm. Parcel sizes get smaller, development comes in, and you can almost see the roads and development kind of snaking their way through the path of least resistance in the area. And like I said, that's nothing super unique to the area, but just the reality of the growth that's occurred. And then you fast forward to 2019 when that photo was, satellite photo was taken, and you really start to see those roads have basically snaked everywhere they could. And that's not quite true, luckily. But they have what I like to say, they take the path of least resistance. The most developable lots, the easiest lots to develop, get developed first. And that unique topography of the Mud Creek Valley is just one of kind of the saving graces of why we still have that forest. Much of central Indiana is incredibly flat. You probably all know that. I grew up in Brownsburg, Indiana, and I think you could see over to Avon from any corner of the city. I used to go sledding in little drainage ditches because there was just no hills. And so that's another thing that drew me to this area is there's lots of topography, a little more challenging to develop, but not undevelopable. And I like to make that clear because I can show you many examples of neighborhoods that have gone on these steep slopes. They deal with challenges, they will, but it's slowed down that pace of development enough to where we can try to preserve some of the best forests we have left. Which is a lot of the reason why people move into these homes is to enjoy the nature. And so we want to encourage responsible development. We're not anti-development. Many of our board members live in the Mud Creek Valley, so we can't enjoy our nice home in the Mud Creek Valley and then tell other people they can't build there. That's hypocritical. But we are trying to kind of direct responsible development so we can all enjoy the natural resources that not only are enjoyable, but really are necessary for all of Indianapolis to be able to reap the ecological services that they provide. And so I realized on the way over here, I updated this slide with the wrong number. So really that should say 28 years of conservation. Math has never been my strong suit, but we were founded in 1994. So we've been around for a while. We were kind of split off from a sister organization called the Sargent Road Association, who's still active in our area, and we work right alongside them. Back, I think it was in the 60s, there was actually, because of the unique topography there, the valley, there was proposals to turn that entire area into a reservoir to flood the entire Mud Creek Valley. And so there was some activism that kind of spurred and organizations formed to fight off that reservoir, which there was already the Geist Reservoir, just a stone's throw away. And so luckily, I might have had lakeside property, so I'm kind of either way on it, but no, really, the entire Mud Creek Valley sits upon a giant underground aquifer. So there was no real need to flood the area when you had those water resources already underground. And currently Citizens Energy pumps a lot of water from the area. They have wellheads all throughout the area. So anyways, we kind of broke off from Sargent Road Association because while they continue to be active in things like zoning, that can definitely have a huge impact on preserving our resources, how many homes per acre, that kind of thing. It's crime, safety. We partner with them closely. They recognize the need for an organization that can hold land and kind of that be the purpose to preserve the aesthetic beauty of the area, but also those natural resources for wildlife and water quality and air quality. And that's where Mud Creek Conservancy formed. And so we've been active for the past 26, 28 years. However, how we've been active is starting to change a little bit. So the map on the right is all those white parcels. And just to give you a little context, at the bottom of that map, the very bottom south edge, that's for the start of Fort Harrison State Park. And then towards the top of the map is 96th Street, which that's basically the boundary line between Fishers and Indianapolis. So that's really the area where we have the most contiguous forest remaining. So while that's not our full project area, that is our kind of our preservation focus to keep some of that connected forest together. And so over the past 28 years, we've been working with landowners to enroll some of those larger vacant properties into conservation easements. I'm sure some of you are probably aware of what a conservation easement is. I'm not going to drone on about it, but essentially it's a legal agreement that we would make with a landowner who wants to see their property, their forest that they worked hard to preserve or restore. They can know that that property will be preserved forever. And that's really our role, is that there has to be an entity that continues in perpetuity to maintain those agreements. A legal document's great, but if there's not someone to fight for it, then it's just a piece of paper. The county's not gonna step in and do anything about it. We have to be the instigators to say there's preservation on that property, you can't develop it. And so that's what we've done. We've kind of created this really great patchwork of preserved properties. Those white parcels entail about 35 acres of habitat that's now under permanent protection through conservation easements. Another great thing about those is that the landowner continues to be the private property owner. It's not a nature park. Those landowners still get all the benefits of having private property. There might be some restrictions on what they can do, but a lot of that we can actually work with the landowner to decide what those restrictions are. Across the board, typically, one of the restrictions that we would require is that trees aren't being cut down for no reason, habitat's being preserved, buildings aren't being built on it, there's no illegal dumping, that kind of thing. But as far as use of the property, hunting, fishing, a lot of that stuff we can work out with the landowner on a case-by-case basis. So while that's great, and actually if you drive Sargent Road from Fall Creek Road to 96th Street, you'll notice that the larger parcels, when you're driving through, if you see a meadow, a nice big 5-7 acre meadow or a big patch of forest, more than likely you'll be able to actually pick out where those are along your drive because there's not a home on it. And most of the other areas around there look a little different. And so we're trying to kind of grow that protection scheme. And in 2019, one of the parcels that we have been really passionate about preserving, there was an opportunity there, but it required us to kind of change our plan of attack from conservation easements to land acquisition. And I'm going to get into that project closer to the end of the presentation. But real quickly, I thought I'd kind of show a little bit about what kind of visitors the Mud Creek Valley draws outside of the residents. So you'll notice probably some familiar faces there. Some things that you might see in residential backyards, other things that really are drawn to those areas because of the larger expansive habitat. So there's lots of migratory songbirds that like to stop and rest on their way. Some stay and nest. And your warblers, there's a cerulean warbler up there that requires those larger, older growth forests. Like I mentioned, things like box turtles that are still holding on here. You typically associate those species more with kind of the Brown County area where you have really large expanses of forest. But we want to keep as much biodiversity as we can in the area. We think not only is it inherently a good thing to do for the wildlife, I think it makes the city a more interesting place to visit, more interesting place to live. And so things like beavers. Another one that surprises people is the southern flying squirrel is an inhabitant in the area, actually adjacent to the future nature park that we're working on. So some really neat species that many of us have never even seen are still in our city, kind of living in secrecy in some of these areas that they hope will last as long as they can. And I didn't mention any of the plants, which I realize I'm on a master gardener's presentation. So I will note just a really great diversity of spring ephemerals, native wildflowers that exist in these woodlands. And another thing that we are trying to do, not only preserving, but restoring. So I think many of you are probably well versed in invasive species. And so we've seen time and time again, when we go into a woodland that's infested with honeysuckle or ivy or vinca or winter creeper, and we can get that out, literally the next year you'll see expanses of wildflowers that have just been in the seed bank waiting for their chance to come out and play. So on my property, I did that with honeysuckle, and the next year the entire area that was half acre that was covered in honeysuckle was May-apples that weren't there the year before. So it can be that quick of an impact. So we're not only trying to preserve, we're also trying to restore and enhance, and that's one easy way that we can do it with a great kind of natural seed bank there. I mentioned the reservoir proposal and the aquifer that sits there. So obviously, as Mud Creek Conservancy, water is a big part of why we do what we do. We all need water, obviously, clean water to live. We all use water and put dirty water back out into the environment. So our creek is like many watersheds. Every watershed has a creek, a river that your water eventually goes out into. And so the Mud Creek watershed, obviously Mud Creek plays that role of draining water, whether it's runoff, what comes out of your septic system ultimately. And I mentioned that Mud Creek flows into Fall Creek, which you're all probably familiar with, a very prominent name in the Indianapolis area, which then flows into the White River. So it is connected to that White River complex. And so the cleaner water we can get coming into Mud Creek, ultimately the cleaner water that if you live near Fall Creek or on the White River, that all of us get to enjoy. So we're all upstream of somebody and we're all downstream of somebody. So I think we all have a role to play to make that a good place to live. But a lot of those forests that we still have are bottomland floodplain forests, and those are critically important, not just for wildlife, but for water quality. They play a huge role in filtering the chemicals, sediment out of the floodwater, out of the runoff, slowing down floodwater so they can actually provide economic benefits as far as lessening the impacts of increased floods, which we're seeing. One thing I love about where we live is that we can be in the forest, but also in 5 minutes get to IKEA or Topgolf or the mall. But the downside of that is that we're 5 minutes from IKEA, Topgolf, and the mall, and so we get all of their water from those massive parking lots. And so it's a love-hate relationship. So we're seeing increased flooding just in the past 5 to 10 years since some of those things have gone in, where Mud Creek used to spill over its banks maybe once a year. The neighbors would all come out and gather and watch it as it's some natural event. And now it happens 2 or 3 times a month. And so it's just become part of the adaptation that our natural resources have had to entertain as we continue to impact everything with what we do. So that brings a whole slew of problems, from erosion, sedimentation, chemical runoff. And so there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in the restoration phase of this. And again, planning when it comes to runoff and drainage, and how can we do that most responsibly. And I mentioned also that we're not about preserving the forests for the wildlife and for the wildflowers, but we also think it's the right thing to do for all of us to enjoy, and it increases your quality of life. And so we're really passionate at Mud Creek Conservancy about connecting people to nature. We think that's one of the best ways to get more people interested in preserving nature and making more responsible environmental choices. And so we really are excited about, we've always tried to be as active as possible, at Earth Day events, at the state fairs that we can do to connect with people. But one of the biggest, I think, handicaps of our organization has been that we have this preserved land that we like to talk about how great it is. And people always ask, well, that sounds awesome. I love the pictures. Where can I go enjoy it? And then we tell people, well, they're all private property. We actually need you to stay away. That's not a great marketing campaign. And so we've always struggled to get membership because of the lack of connectivity that we can provide. Seeing as all those conservation easements they provide all the benefits of preserved land except for the public benefit of in-person experiences. And that's just kind of setting the stage for again, the Sargent Road Nature Park portion of this presentation. But I wanted to provide some fact checking because we all know how the term fake news has taken over. And clearly I'm biased because I'm volunteering for Mud Creek Conservancy and I live near Mud Creek. So of course I think it's the best place on the world. But I did want to provide some kind of fact checking for why others actually think it's a really important place to preserve when it comes to the greater Indianapolis area. Over the past couple of years, the Indiana Forest Alliance has another nonprofit, some similar missions. You may know the Forest Alliance, but one neat thing that they have done recently is they spent 2 years contracting some of the best professionals with GIS and forest inventory to just take a snapshot of, what do we have left in Indianapolis, just kind of as a case study that they hope to grow to other cities in the state. What are our urban forests? What do we have left? Rather than just rallying when one 6-acre forest is getting cut down and trying to stop that, how do we get ahead of that and say, here's really the top priority forest that we should be working proactively to preserve, rather than always being behind the gun and standing in front of the bulldozer. So this study was kind of aimed at doing that, and provided some really nice insight and kind of affirmation for us and for what we're doing. And so that map, and albeit it's small and hard to read, so I'm going to kind of describe it to you. Basically, in the very center of that map is downtown Indianapolis. And so we're all pretty familiar with the 465 loop. And so basically this is showing on the very top left corner, the northwest corner, that's Eagle Creek. area. The top right corner is the Mud Creek Valley, Fort Harrison, Fall Creek area. And then the bottom left is kind of that southwest Indianapolis that follows the White River. And that's why there's some parcels being lit up there. And I can't think of the name of the creek that's running on the bottom right of the map. But anyways, that map is showing they went through a lengthy process of kind of evaluating different characteristics of forests, whether it be the kind of the size and maturity of the forest. Topography played a role in it, because one interesting thing that actually I didn't have a slide about, but the Nature Conservancy is really shifting their priorities for preservation to what is going to be resilient over when climate change continues to exist. So climate change is going to happen. You're going to see southern species moving north, and that's going to be a natural thing that happens. But what they're finding is actually these areas that are topographically unique, that more topography, provide a better chance to not only welcome new species because of these slopes. You all know, south facing slopes get more sun. All these different kind of characteristics actually provide a natural transition for, the species that are here can then kind of slowly migrate to the north facing slopes, where they get a little bit of different change in climate, where those southern species might find a home on those south facing slopes. So topography plays a big role in how resilient a site is for climate change. And so we have some high scores for that. Anything that's along a waterway is very high priority to preserve for all of those floodplain and riparian kind of filtration benefits I mentioned. And then connectivity is another big piece, which I always drone on about. So I'll try to stop using the word connected or connectivity. But anyway, so the blue parcels are the top 100 forests that study showed that should be preserved first. And one neat thing that happened was it basically lit up our entire project area for preservation that we had identified as our top priority, as actually that should be the top priority for the entire city to preserve for all of those benefits. Along with Eagle Creek on the west side of town, we kind of have these mirror great resources on both the west side and the east side. However, Eagle Creek already has a great public park there. We have Fort Harrison State Park, and then we're also trying to add some more public benefit through some nature park efforts. That's a painting that I did of watercolor. No, that's just a very low resolution, zoomed in parcel. So the official report from the Forest for Indy project hasn't gone out to the public yet. So some of these are lower resolution files. But that kind of shows the bottom of that blue is Fall Creek and the Mud Creek confluence. The top is 96th Street. So that's our project area. And just kind of showing, unfortunately, a very low resolution image of those green parcels are the next best forest after those top 100. So it really is essentially, if we're looking at the Indianapolis area, we should be trying to preserve every remaining forest in the Mud Creek Valley because of the importance it has to all those effects. There's just a more zoomed in map of where our conservation easements are currently, where Fort Harrison State Park is, and kind of the blue lines are Mud Creek and Fall Creek, which Fall Creek, if you didn't know, it continues, it flows into Geist Reservoir. It creates essentially Geist Reservoir. And then the tailwaters at the dam is the continuation of Fall Creek south of Geist. And then so that little parcel that zoomed in there, well, big parcel that zoomed in there, multicolored, that's the parcel that we've been working for the past 2 years to protect and create a new nature park called Sargent Road Nature Park. And so you can see it kind of fits right within the project area that we're working with, high priority for us and for just forest preservation in general. And that's where it lays. So the north boundary of that parcel is 82nd Street. It's now a 4-lane road. You may have been down it probably. Kind of if you want to get to the east side, that's probably where your GPS is going to take you. So it's a busy intersection on the north end of that. And then the entire west boundary of that parcel is Sargent Road, where it gets its name, Sargent Road Nature Park. So that kind of gives you the lay of the land there. It's bound by 82nd Street, Sargent Road, and then on the east side, not directly adjacent, but the floodplain forests of Mud Creek, and Mud Creek flows along the eastern portion of that area. And so while I've droned on and on about why this area is so great and why we should be investing resources into preserving some of those those forests in these areas. One thing that's also unique about this area, while we do have Fort Harrison State Park to the south, when you look at this pretty heavily residential area bound by Fall Creek, 96th Street, and Hague Road, there's about 13,000 people who live in that area. It's home to Lawrence North High School, Mary Castle Elementary, actually 2 or 3 other elementary schools. The Boy Scout headquarters, Crossroads of America, is at the very bottom left of that. And there are 0 public parks or nature areas in that entire 8 square mile area, which is kind of baffling, but not incredibly surprising when you look at Marion County on the national scale of park space per resident. We win like last place on that every single year, or close to last place. So this happens to be one of those kind of park deserts. And so when we started formulating a plan and a vision, how can we preserve this 25 acres of, we know it's a high priority preservation wise, what other benefits can it bring? And it kind of helped us craft our vision for creating our first public natural area, and this whole area's first public natural area. And so there's a group of some of our volunteers and board members, and this was shortly after we covered up a sign behind that, which was a giant for sale sign that we'd been looking at for 5 years. And so that parcel that we've been working to preserve has been for sale really for about 25 years since we formed. I found a handwritten note from the sellers back, I think it was 1995. And we were asking, what would they want to sell that property for? So that kind of tells you that it's been a priority for us all along. It's just never been a realistic opportunity for us. And that handwritten note from 28 years ago, the price they wanted then was 3 times what we paid today, which is the opposite of how real estate prices are trending. So that just kind of shows you it was always for sale, but it wasn't really. However, that started to change over the past 10 years. And we kind of been keeping an eye on the property. They're asking way too much for it. It's never going to get developed. Oh, there's floodplains on the property. It's never going to get developed. None of that's true. I can show you 6 neighborhoods in the area that probably shouldn't be there, but are sitting on a floodplain or near a floodplain. So none of that really made us rest easy. All it did was kind of slow the pressure and slow the price drops of that property. And so as the community started once Zillow became a thing and you could kind of keep tabs on what are they asking for that property, they started slashing that price by $100,000 each year. And so everyone's starting to think, oh crap, this is going to sell soon because that seems like a pretty good deal if I was a developer. And so we kind of gathered some resources. To be transparent, we've been a very, very low budget organization our entire existence. All of those conservation easements were donated. We didn't pay a dime for those protections. We may have helped with legal fees or crafting the surveys or that kind of thing. But we probably operated on less than $2,000 a year. And so when you start looking at how can we purchase this $1 million property, which it was 10 years ago, that's a challenge. So what we did first was we had the property appraised. Sargent Road Association funded that for us to kind of get the project off the ground. And that gave us an idea of how much time do we have given the current trend of price drops, and when's it going to get to that appraised price or close. And so we did that, and we realized, okay, maybe we have 2 years if a developer's actually waiting for that appraised price to hit, which many of them know it's worth more than that and would have invested sooner. So that kind of lit a fire under us and let us, we kind of had to make a call. Do we want to organize and try to do something, or should we just let nature take its course and see what happens there? And we started holding some meetings around the community, pitching the idea of a nature park there to preserve the space, knowing that we'd have to create something exciting in order to garner that type of support. When you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars, it's more than a lemonade stand and cookie sales. That's big time money. And so we had great support from the community. And so we felt good about making a pitch to the landowners. And ultimately, to me, the biggest victory, but also the scariest moment of the entire project was when the landowners signed our purchase agreement, which took the property off the market for 2 years. So we knew there was pressure. We knew they'd been talking to developers. That gave us 2 years with full rights to the property with $0 in on the project. And so we put $10,000 down as soon as we could, and that gave us that 2 years to raise the purchase price, so over $500,000. So they did come down from their asking price quite a bit, And so that was a success. And just the fact that they signed the purchase agreement, it created life to the project. And then from there, we were all excited. We were celebrating that we had a purchase agreement. And then the next day, then it hits you, we have to raise $500,000 in 2 years. And so we got to work and did the best we could. Okay. Can you try clicking on that slide? Go back. Yeah, just click on the leaf there, where you might have to right click, and there should be a link to a video, and it's
not sharing.
okay. Oops. That's all right. If we have time at the end, I can we can track down a video. But we have just a quick video kind of showing a virtual tour, a 2-minute tour of the property, which hopefully we'll be able to show you. But we can continue on a little bit and see if we can't just go to YouTube and pull that up. Yeah, you may have to go to PowerPoint, to the actual PowerPoint program to do that. I can continue talking if you want to work on that for a second. That's kind of what we were up against. 2 years, $500,000. And so we kind of started brainstorming all the different ways that we all can think about to raise money, holding galas and fundraisers and festivals. And so that was October 2019 when we got that project started. And then you can imagine by the time we went public with it, it was a couple months later. We did some due diligence, phase 1 environmental assessments, making sure there was nothing under the surface that was going to prevent us from moving forward. And then so we had all these plans, getting ready to really launch some exciting things. And COVID hit, like as many of you remember. So 2020, right when we were in the heart of our fundraising, we had to completely kind of shift gears to what we all think about normal fundraising activities. And now how do we do this under a global pandemic? So one of the things we did was that video. I hope we can show that. If not, I can give you the link. You can watch it at home. We created a virtual tour so people could see the property we're trying to preserve, and they could kind of understand why we think it's special. You probably remember doing a lot of outdoor meetings with your family and neighbors. And so we were lucky that this project fit with that. And so we put a lot of work and effort into creating a tour path. So prior to that, walking through that property was basically walking through, chest high blackberry bushes and small saplings. Not a fun activity to take potential donors on a tour of when they're going to come out in rags and covered in burrs. It's important to put some sweat equity in and create a nice enough path to get people to see the property. So that was the first thing we did. From there, we held a lot of just open hikes where we would tour people through the property, talk to them about the campaign. Obviously, we built out a nice web page, created some videos so people could from home learn. But we did over 100 small tours with 5 to 15 people where people were comfortable, oftentimes with masks outdoors, because if you remember at the beginning, we didn't know how bad it spread, how easily it spread. So some hot, sweaty tours with masks on, but it was really a great way to interact individually with almost every single donor, but also show people firsthand the property that needed to be preserved. So there may actually be some takeaways from that other land trusts use, rather than saying, give us money and we'll go protect some land. I think people like seeing what's at stake and experiencing the property, knowing that this could be developed. And so I think that actually turned out to be a positive for us in hindsight. And so this is a concept kind of map of the area. It's a long, rather narrow parcel, even though it's not that narrow when you consider it's 25 acres. And so that's a large urban parcel. There's not many 20+ acre parcels just left in the city in general. It's not a large parcel. When I go and talk to my other land trusts, they're working on 7,500, 200 acre parcels out in rural Indiana, oftentimes for cheaper than what we paid for this 25 acre parcel. And so it's interesting talking to some of those land trusts, and they just can't believe, how is it worth that much money for 25 acres of forest when we could, preserve 200 acres over here? And I think the answer to that is it's not worth more than those forests, but you still have to invest. If you don't invest that money here, that's the only option. So if you want to have forests in an urban area, it's expensive. And so while ultimately our budgets may be similar, if we can get, 25, 50, 100 acres preserved in this area, financially, that's going to be equivalent to 1,000 acres in another rural county. And I think that's just the nature of living in different areas, the different development pressures and prices, and something we're going to be up against. But happy to report, you can go next slide. Well, so that is just kind of some concept imagery of what we want at the site. It's going to be, we call it Sargent Road Nature Park. One, it was a catchy phrase, but it's essentially going to be a nature preserve, but maybe just slightly more welcoming than your typical nature preserve with a gravel lot and a small little trailhead. We do want people in the community to feel welcome there and hopefully connect new people at that site. So we will have a parking area, some educational signage so we can passively educate at the site, as well as the thing we're most excited about is being able to actively educate at the site. As I mentioned, having all private property parcels in our conservation easements, it was always a challenge to, multiple times a year hold a workshop or get people out and hands-on interact with people. And so we're really, really excited about being able to do that here at Sargent Road Nature Park and have already been doing it. It'll be about 1.5 miles of trail. So basically loops around the whole property and some benches along the way. And some of those benches and educational signage, that also is in turn some donor recognition opportunities that we have to have people sponsor some of those minimal infrastructure at the site. That will also be from the beginning, we actually pivoted from an initial vision of having it be an art and nature park. And just with the large amount of money we had to raise, doing that alone without creating a sculpture park was enough liability for us. So we kind of pledged from the beginning that when we do have infrastructure, we're going to work with local artisans to create the benches. So it won't be your typical, Costco benches and educational signage. We want to create that into something unique and locally crafted as well. And here's a kind of a snapshot of, I want to make sure how am I doing on time? We're good.
About
10, okay, perfect.
The slides aren't changing for Zoom because yes.
Yeah.
No, we're not.
Oh, they're not changing on Zoom?
Did I?
Zoom computer is separate from the, so you've got to have both of them. Slide show. And the fact that we only see the speaker's chin.
And not the best angle, is it? I know.
It's not yours, Paul. Forget this by the time we don't do it anymore.
I'll tell you something. My wife works for a company here in Indianapolis, a global company, and they still haven't figured out hybrid meetings either. And they've got unlimited resources. So it is a challenge. So I applaud you for your effort in trying because it's challenging.
And videos don't apparently work because of the Zoom.
Yeah, that's probably the case. Yeah. So I'll there's an easy way to view that on your own or on your phone. So while we're waiting, I'll continue kind of talking about the slides that we hope everyone on Zoom will be able to see here soon. And so these are some snapshots of just another reason why I really like this property. While it's only 25 acres, it feels much bigger because in a 40-minute hike on the 1.5 mile trail, you can see all sorts of different habitat types that in a state park, you will be able to see all those, but you might have to spend all day hiking to these different areas. But because it's a more condensed site, you can see meadows. And in these meadows, you'll see kind of unique wildlife to those. So one of the neat birds that we have that continues to come back to these kind of early successional kind of scrubby meadows is the prairie warbler, a cool little yellow bird on the bottom left there. Not a super common one in urban areas. They kind of like those, like I said, those older meadows, and meadows are not a rare or declining habitat type across Indiana. So it's basically a fallow field that you let grow up. But in my perspective, I don't think there's really been any inventories on this. I think it's a very rare area in highly developable urban areas, because to have a meadow, you basically have to have a flat piece of dry ground that nothing's happening on it. And most of our flat pieces of dry ground are either being prepped for development, have already been developed, are turf grass. And so we see a lot of activity in these areas because I think they are becoming so rare when it comes to kind of that greater Indianapolis area. Whereas a forest, you know, those large trees do a little bit better of a job speaking for themselves and saying, don't cut me down, develop on the meadow. Like that's what you would do if you're a developer first, right? You choose that versus cutting down all the trees. So we're going to try to maintain some of these habitat types in their current state. While, you know, we need more forests and we could just let everything reforest. We're going to do that on probably 75% of the site, let nature take its course, grow into a forest. But we do want to maintain some of these unique areas where, you know, you get the milkweed, which can then benefit the monarch, and that's an imperiled species. You get these unique bird species, New England aster, those types of wildlife and plants that are neat to have. And so if we don't do anything, you know, basically that would be, you know, we probably won't be doing any burning just because of the proximity to residential areas, but probably mowing those areas once a year just to kind of maintain that current state of a meadow that's trying to become a forest. Can you go back one? Oh. And so most of the site, if we didn't do anything to it, you all know this better than anyone as gardeners. If you don't weed your garden, well, you will get trees in your garden, right? And they'll get as big as you let them get. And that's Indiana as a whole. Indiana used to be 98% forest. So that's what the seed bank is. That's what Indiana wants to become, is a forest. So luckily, most of the site, when it was taken out of agriculture in probably the late 60s, the site was never prepped for development, which is really a great thing when it comes to having a kind of a ready-made nature park. So once active agriculture was removed, owners just kind of let it sit. And that's been a blessing because what we've seen is a lot of great natural regeneration, young forests growing up, tulip poplars, sycamore trees, dogwoods, lots of nice native wildflowers, and then the wildlife that accompanies that. Obviously, with those early successional forests, aside from just letting Indiana soil do its thing and become a forest, we will provide some helping hands of keeping the invasives down and allowing the good things to grow and get sunlight and that kind of thing. But we're going to try to foster those forests into mature forests. Another neat thing about the property is there's 3 streams that cut across the property. And so you get some more unique plants and wildlife. One of those streams is perennial, meaning it always has water. So you get some really cool fish life. All of these photos were taken out on the site. So some neat fish, tropical colors like the orange throat darter on the bottom left. You get some colorful birds that come into the wetland areas like the prothonotary warbler. There's a long-eared sunfish up at the top left. Then as well as really great salamander populations in some of those streams, the southern two-line salamander. And then some really great flowers and plants that grow in those wetland areas. So the forest that borders Mud Creek is a floodplain forest, and those are where you get the huge cottonwood trees that you can't wrap your arms around because that area was too wet to farm. So those areas were preserved by basically they were a nuisance, and so they farmed up to those. And so we have young forest meadows, and then those older forests are basically that farm edge historically. And so we have a great mature forest on the site that is also a wetland, a bottomland forest. And so you get species like the blue flag iris growing there. So that's another common for if you're a flower gardener, you probably dealt with irises, beautiful flowers. Those are wild, native. Another cool one is the green dragon, that kind of unique, kind of tropical looking plant. It's related to Jack in the Pulpit. That's a neat plant. Large flowered valerian is the neat kind of narrow flower on there. And then all sorts of different goldenrods and coneflower species that inhabit there. So it's a very pretty place in the heat of the summer. And so kind of the same habitat, but we're talking about the forest, and those mature forests, again, those are probably another thing that's becoming increasingly rare in the city just because of how much change the city's been undergoing for the past 100 years. But those mature forests really bring in a lot of those unique migratory bird species that when they're flying over and they're needing a rest or some food, they really hone in on those big patches of forest. And so it's probably towards the end of April into May. We do some birding tours out there because it's a great place to see a variety of birds that you won't be able to see in your backyard typically. If you do follow us on Facebook or on mudcreekconservancy.org, we'll be posting our events here soon, and you can get signed up for those and take a hike at the park and see some cool birds. And so this is a map. I started to allude to it, but we were successful in our 2-year campaign to raise the money to purchase our first owned and acquired property. And we definitely weren't successful on our own. We knew that wouldn't be possible. We engaged many people in the city, but specifically really right around the nature park area. So that was a great thing to see. The neighbors were supporting it. They were excited to be able to, walk down the sidewalk and get to a nature park. But it was also really cool to see, and this is an old map, I need to update it, how many people from the west side of Indianapolis or downtown Indianapolis were really excited about this project, because unfortunately, if you lived in downtown Indianapolis, you still have to drive 10 or 15 or 20 minutes to get to a nature park. So this is going to provide benefits to not just our neighborhood, but really to the whole city, where it's worth a drive to go take a hike. And that's showing donors around. That star is the nature park site. And so that was just a really great thing to see, is that we were really lighting up the neighborhood and surrounding areas with people who were supporting the project. The $500,000 that we needed to purchase the property was entirely raised through grassroots fundraising, individual families, and some community foundations that stepped up as well and helped us. So we didn't have any city or state or federal funding to get this done. And so I'm not going to read through all of these, but these are kind of some of the things that we were kind of pitching to people, knowing that, we need people to invest in the project. And so we saw that. We have over 80 families and individuals that have given over $1,000 to the project. And I think we try to kind of lay out what the returns on your investment are. Because unfortunately, we're not a developer, so we can say, oh, $500,000 for 25 acres, that's nothing. I'm going to make 1.5 million on it. We're trying to raise that money to do nothing with it. So there is no actual return on investment. So we really have to highlight what the intangible returns on investment are. And a lot of those I've already talked about. It's the recreation value, the education value, quality of life that you get from being outdoors and connecting with nature. And I had this mental policy that if somebody reached out and wanted to partner with us, we would always say yes, no matter what it was or who it was, because we needed all the help we could get. And one of the great partnerships we formed was with a local Girl Scout troop who became our ambassadors for the project. They approached us one day when they saw us out there. They had seen some forest get cut down nearby where they would hang out, and they were a little devastated by seeing that happen. And so they wanted to do something to prevent that. And so they've been working with us. They all put together little research projects on the site and kind of made pitches to donors on why they should help the project. And so that turned out to be a really cool partnership that actually they now have a documentary coming out just on them, and we're just a small part of it. So they've become locally famous for their efforts in the Indiana Humanities Waterways film project, which is debuting in a couple of weeks. They have, like I said, a really cool documentary that we're a part of, but I've not seen yet. So I'm excited to see kind of their story get told and hopefully inspire some others in their generation to do the same. And this is the most important page of this presentation. Anyways, this is where you can donate if you want to donate, but more importantly, it's the same place where you can just learn more. Our webpage is maybe too expansive, but you can go on the sargentroad.com, Sargent Road Nature Park.com, and you can look at wildlife and plants that we found out at the site. You can keep tabs of the fundraising at the site. So I mentioned we were successful in purchasing the property. However, the vision to create a nature park is still underway. And so we own the property, it's preserved, and now we're working to fulfill our vision, get that parking lot put in, working on those educational signs, the benches, and with the ultimate goal of this phase 2 of fundraising, the implementation phase, is the ultimate goal is to get this open to the public, and specifically our over 600 donors who have invested in it. And so we hope to do that by the end of the year, but we are actively fundraising for that. We're about 75% of the way to our goal, which was about $370,000 that we thought we needed to start, at least get the baseline vision for the nature park, and with some continued enhancement fundraising to follow. That's my contact information, and I'll leave some of my cards and some cards that has our website on it as well on the table back there before I go, so you can follow up with me or keep track of the project. And if we have any time, I'll just open it up to you guys to ask some questions or have some discussion.
We do have some time, so anybody who would like to ask then a question, thank you very much. That
Yeah,
was a
thank you.
fascinating presentation. I'm sure there'll be some, yeah, we
Will
can turn the
your
lights on.
Will your trails be ADA compliant?
That's something we're working through right now, but I will say our trails. Oh, sorry. Paul's question was, will your trails be ADA compliant? I'd say as far as nature preserves go, that's a pretty rare accomplishment. But what we are going to strive to do is make them accessible trails. And there's a big difference between accessible trails and compliant trails. I'm sure our parking lot area and maybe a shorter trail segment closer to the parking lot will try to get compliant. But the neat part about the property is there's incredible topography to view, but for the most part, aside from going over a couple of streams, it's the valley. So it's a very flat property. So as long as trying to keep that in mind when we build bridges, when if we ever get to the phase of building boardwalks, we've already actually toured people out there in power chairs and they got through the entire site with a dirt trail. So we want to make it so people can access the whole thing, but maybe not checking all the state boxes.
Is all that land that you're talking about there, is that all privately owned or is it some other owned by the state?
So all of the land that I've been showing on the kind of the maps of the Mud Creek Valley, it's all privately owned. One of our conservation easements that actually abuts Fort Harrison State Park, and if you ever drive all the way up Fall Creek Road, where Sargent Road, where you turn left on the Sargent Road, on the right hand side, you'll see some tree plantings there. That's a portion of that open meadow is our conservation easement, but the whole thing is owned by Citizens Energy. So that's the one kind of big parcel in our area that's not privately owned, but it's corporately owned. And I'm going to be working on them to see if we can't change that. So.
So you're funded by private donations and grants?
Yeah, so thus far,
Repeat the question.
so you are funded by private donations and grants, and so that's correct. Thus far, for the purchase of the property, which was over $500,000, that was all private donations and community foundations. So we've had the Herbert Simon Family Foundation contributed in a big way when we really needed a boost. They gave $100,000 in the first phase. The Ephraimson Family Fund, another very philanthropic fund in the Indianapolis area, has contributed. And in both of the, Simon Family has then contributed again to our phase 2 of the campaign. So it's been foundation and grants and private donations.
Have you reached out to Nina Basin for your charitable trust?
But we have, luckily and unluckily, they had basically a full slate of great stuff they were doing in Indianapolis tied closer to the White River. And so their environmental funds were allocated for the next several years when we were needing that initial support. But certainly a funder that we want to stay in contact with if we have more opportunities. Yeah. I will add to that is that we had not accepted any state, city, or federal funds. That is about to change as we just completed a matching grant campaign with the Indiana Housing and Community Development Authority. That's led by Suzanne Crouch, the Lieutenant Governor, and they have a grant program for space creating to kind of enhance communities. And if you can set your own goal up to $50,000, and if you can raise that within 60 days, they will match that. And so we just were successful on that, raised $50,000 in 30 days, and we'll be getting a $50,000 grant from the state. And that'll be our first state grant. There's very few ties to that, which I'm always wary of with state and federal money, other than they ask that whatever that space is be open to the public within a year of receiving those funds. So if nothing else, it's just an extra kick in the behind for us to get this done.
That's great.
Yeah, the question. Yeah, so the question was, within our donors, have we found people who have also given conservation easements as well as financial support? And the answer to that would be yes. Actually, almost all of our current conservation easement holders I can think of were at least $1,000 donors to the program. And so luckily that shows you that those conservation easements transfer from landowner to landowner forever. And so many times the landowner that we have on a conservation easement wasn't the one who actually enrolled it, but it shows you that we continue to get conservation minded landowners owning those properties, probably because they're excited to have a 5-acre preserve meadow attached to their house. And so they continue to be board members or donors. And as far as how small of a parcel we would accept as a conservation easement, really a case by case basis. Typically they're at least over an acre. Unless it was just, we have adjacent conservation easements or there's a critically important area to preserve, then we might go small. We do have some smaller ones than that, but they're actually adjacent to the nature park in that bottomland forest where our property meets private landowners' property before we get to Mud Creek. Actually, half of those 12 parcels are under current easements with Mud Creek. So it's 25 acres nature park, but we actually have 30 acres of preserved forest at that site, and we hope to increase that as well.
Is the park at a stage where we could drive somewhere in the park and go in, or is it still closed?
It is not open to the public yet. And that's how we keep people excited to donate, right? Can't let them have a nature park yet. But no, it is just for liability reasons. And right now, you get a rain and the trail's pretty muddy. So what we have been doing and will continue to do, especially for our current donors, is we want them to continue to be able to enjoy the property as much as we can. So we're going to continue doing, open hikes out there. The easiest way is just membership is $20 for our organization. It hasn't changed since we were founded with inflation. So you can become a member, and as soon as we have your email address, you get our newsletter, and that alerts you to upcoming hikes and that kind of thing. So we have started doing more now that we own the property. There's a little less liability concerns now that it's insured and all of that kind of stuff. So we have been doing more open hike days where it doesn't have to be a guided tour where I jabber on. You've already heard me do that. So we'll open up the park, we'll set up a tent, and you guys can hike the property, bird watch, whatever you want to do. So we will do a lot more of that this year, as the construction hopefully allows us to do.
Do you need volunteers?
We do, and actually, I meant to.
Repeat the question.
Sorry. Do you need volunteers? And so actually, we're doing a volunteer activity next Saturday with the Rotary Club.
Yay.
Yeah. And
Go Marie.
yeah, and so Marie that's partnering with us to help remove some invasive species. So we've been getting to work. It'll be a forever volunteer opportunity to not just remove invasive species, but just keep them suppressed. And so we're going to try to get a head start on that with honeysuckle and autumn olive on next Saturday from 10 to 1.
I thought it was 9 to 1.
9 to 1. Okay. So if you're interested, and it is a pretty physically intensive, generally task, but even hauling smaller branches, putting them in a wheelbarrow, we can be pretty conducive to a lot of different levels. But we'll be chainsawing, stump treating, hauling out big old bushy honeysuckle and autumn olive, creating some nicer views and welcoming next spring's wildflowers, hopefully. All right, thank you. Oh, and I did want to make one more sales pitch. I was interested in your guys' talk about rebranding and t-shirts. And so we rebranded as an organization prior to our project as well. And so we've got a lot of really neat, just for the nature park, and I should have unfolded these, but we've got some really cool art that was done by a local designer, monarchs, foxes, great horned owls. So we have t-shirts and mugs and stickers and everything that was on that survey you can buy. And if you go to sargentroadnaturepark.com, you can actually order online and it'll ship to your door.
Nice.
And so, yeah, so that's a great way to support the park and wear some cool nature art.
Thank you again, Ben.
Oop, I turned it off on it. Sorry.
And you're going to leave some cards up
Yeah, I'm gonna
on
set
the
up a little
table.
section over
Good.
there.